Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the violence link. My name is Trevor Timchuk, and I'm the chair of the Communications and Knowledge Exchange Committee for the Provincial Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee. Just a few housekeeping items. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the webinar. To ask a question at any point, you can put in your question in the Q&A or the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to it, try to get to it at the end of the webinar. This is being recorded, and the PowerPoint presentation will be emailed out following the webinar. There will also be a brief evaluation survey following the webinar. Please complete it. The HSJCC network is comprised of 39 local committees, 14 regional committees, and 1 provincial HSJCC. Each is a voluntary collaboration between health and social service organizations, community mental health and addiction organizations, and partners from the justice sector, including Crown attorneys, judges, police services, and correctional service providers. Our presenters today are Hannah Brown, Dr. Margaret Doyle, and Leslie Hatfield. And I'll turn it over to Hannah, I believe.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my slides going here on the screen. Thank you very much for that introduction, Trevor. We're really pleased to be here today. First off, introductions to your presenters today. So as Trevor mentioned, I'm the manager for the Criminal Justice System Reform Programme at Humane Canada. That programme incorporates the National Centre for the Prosecution of Animal Cruelty and also the Canadian Violence Link Coalition. And if I could ask Inspector Leslie Hadfield, if you could introduce yourself, please. Oh, Leslie, you're on mute.
Of course I'm muted. I'm Leslie Hadfield. I am the social psychology instructor at the Police Academy in PEI. Yeah, and I've been involved with the coalition with Hannah for well over a year now, I believe, on the steering committee and the strategic planning committee as well.
Thank you. And Dr. Margaret Doyle.
So I'm Dr. Margaret Doyle. I work in Calgary, Alberta. I'm a forensic veterinarian, and I work with law enforcement, prosecutors, and other social services to assist in investigations on animal abuse. Along with Leslie and Hannah, I'm also part of the committee for the Link Coalition of Canada. I've been happy to working with Humane Canada for a few years, basically now. So thanks so much for having us.
Thank you both. So I want to go over what we're going to cover today in this presentation. We're going to give you an introduction to the violence link, explain a little bit about why the violence link is relevant to your work. I'm then going to ask Inspector Hadfield to dive deeper into the violence link. Dr. Doyle is going to quickly go over some signs of animal abuse that you may well encounter in your work. And then we're going to wrap up with some potential solutions to the violence link in this context. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Humane Canada's violence link work and the Canadian Violence Link Coalition. And then we'll finish with some questions. So let's get going. So what is the violence link? Research shows that violence towards people and violence towards animals are part of a larger pattern of violent crimes that coexist. So cases of interpartner violence, sexual abuse, and child abuse, including child sexual abuse, gang violence, youth crime, organised crime, assault, homicide, weapons, and illicit drugs also commonly involve animal abuse. This phenomenon is known as the violence link. Here's a diagram which was put together by Dr. Rochelle Stevenson, who's one of the Canadian academic researchers on the violence link, which shows you that overlapping aspect of these various forms of interpersonal violence and animal abuse. So why is the violence link relevant to you? The violence link concept is part of the One Health concept, which looks at the overlap and effect between environmental health, animal health, and human health. This is ultimately about understanding your client's whole situation in order to prevent further conflict with the criminal justice system. So more specifically, why the violence link is relevant to you in your work. 2 items. The reason why your client may be in conflict with the justice system could be trauma caused by witnessing animal abuse or domestic violence. The second reason is that the mistreatment and abuse of animals is a significant indicator of violence towards humans, up to and including intimate partner abuse, sexual assault, rape, and murder. So I'm going to quickly go over the research. There's 40 years plus of research on this across the world, in the US and in Canada, on the violence links. I'm going to quickly go through that research to illustrate to you this link and why it's so important. So abuse of animals is a significant indicator of violence towards humans. The consequence for you is that if your client is in conflict with the justice system regards animal abuse, there are likely other forms of criminality involved, whether by your client or within your client's household or environment, social network. Criminality caused by trauma. The research shows us that whether a child witnesses animal abuse or domestic violence in the home growing up, there is evidence that the psychological trauma has lasting effects which may lead to later criminality if proper early interventions are not implemented. So here's some specific research. A parent's history of animal abuse is predictive of a child's later involvement in IPV perpetration. And the early introduction to animal cruelty through exposure to dogfighting, especially repeated acts, impacts development and has strong links to later interpersonal violence. In one Canadian study, children exposed to domestic violence were 2.95 times more likely to have displayed animal cruelty than those in the non-exposure group. And children who witnessed their parents perpetrating violent IPV behaviours are more likely to commit animal abuse. Witnessing physical fighting or physical abuse between parents has been associated with substantial level of cruelty to animals. Specifically with regards to youths committing animal abuse, environmental factors predict, and I wanted to set out this research because it actually was just published in October of this year. Environmental factors predict children's animal cruelty include exposure to childhood adversity, especially experiences of violence and witnessing animal cruelty. Childhood animal cruelty is recurrent or has extreme links to later interpersonal violence. Psychological risk factors linked to childhood animal cruelty include externalizing disorders, lower empathy, lower self-esteem, poorer family function, and attitudes accepting of cruelty. Witnessing animal cruelty, as I've said, is a serious risk factor for a range of internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So now I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Dr. Hadfield, and she is going to dive deeper into the link between animal abuse and interpersonal violence. Then I will pass over to Dr. Doyle, who is going to do a quick overview of some of the signs of animal abuse that you should be aware of that may indicate the violence link. So I'm going to provide a warning here that some of the following slides include information and photos of abused or injured animals, also potentially humans and children, and so your discretion is advised. So I'm going to pass over to Inspector Hadfield. I will stop sharing my screen.
Oh, there we go. Takes a minute to do that. There we go. How's that format look? Okay. Is that okay? All right. Thank you, Hannah. Before I begin, I just want to give you a bit more of my background. So I am an instructor at the Police Academy, where I've been here for the last 12 years as a police officer instructor. But prior to me coming to the Academy, my background is human services, and I was a counselor for a number of years, and I worked in group homes. I did applied behavioral interventions with high risk individuals, and actually co-authored a training manual for autism. So I'm very familiar with the clients that that you're involved with. And one of my keen reasons that I entered policing and became an instructor at the Academy. So as Hannah said, it's been established for decades through evidence-based research that where there is animal abuse, there's a very high probability that a violent crime has or will be committed by a human. And there's many organizations such as the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the FBI, the International Associations of Chiefs of Police, and many crime studies in various universities have supported this. We know there's a heavy link between animal abuse and in particular domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But relatively little attention is paid to the abuse of animals as a tool or a method for the domestic abuse. Okay. I have to go back here. Natasha, there we go. Is that full screen?
No, if you, no, we see your PowerPoint
Okay.
version.
Go back to where it was then.
Yeah, you can go
to there. Try that again. Okay. How's that?
it's not in the full, oh, there we go. Okay,
You got it. Okay. We know that in domestic violence or IPV cases, up to 93% of these cases use or involve an animal. And we know that kids that are exposed to intimate partner violence or domestic violence have also been exposed to this pet abuse. Up to 51% say that they've actually protected their animal from being hurt. So they've stood in between a violent suspect to protect their animal. We know that children that witness animal cruelty experience significant more risk of adolescent or adult interpersonal violence. So they're at a greater risk of actually getting involved with somebody who may be violent towards them as a victim themselves, or perhaps on the other side, become an actual suspect or abuser. And as well, they experience many more mental health issues, such as PTSD, anxiety, depression, personality disorders. And because of this, the violence spreads and perpetuates. PTSD, we relatively know now that can be passed on from the mother to the baby if the mother is in an abusive situation while pregnant. So babies actually can be born with PTSD, which already sets the stage for a very weak foundation. We know that evidence suggests that there are two things happening in domestic violence that can lead to victims developing mental health disorders. And one thing is that they're more likely to experience DV that creates the mental health disorder, or is it that the mental health disorder predisposes them to getting involved with domestic violence? The same is true for trauma. So those that have trauma histories often get into situations with more trauma. We know that domestic violence is a form of psychological maltreatment, and it's a form of emotional abuse. Witnessing intimate partner violence or not protecting a child from witnessing it is also considered, criminality is a form of emotional neglect, which has huge ramifications on the child. There is substantial amount of literature suggesting that the abuse, including emotional, that is observed to the caregiver has actually more negative impact on that child than being abused themselves. And often victims will say the child wasn't present, they didn't hear what happened. Only hearing the abuse is actually more detrimental to witnessing it. We know that these kids who are growing up in a toxic environment often have behaviors outside of the home, including bullying, drug usage, getting involved with gang behavior, and they can become the bullies themselves. They don't have power in the home, so they try to abuse the power in the school, in their intimate relationships. And if they have seen that animal abuse, sometimes they may abuse animals to regain that power. California State University says that animal abuse is a significant indicator of severe childhood abuse. And most children learn antisocial or atypical, often violent behavior from those around them, including their caregivers or their parents. Witnessing brutality to the animals for the young people makes them prone to aggression for life. This is fairly recent research on domestic violence. And not only has most animal abusers been exposed to violence and abuse, but that this has resulted in reduced empathy and a normalization of aggression. So desensitization of abuse, of the violence, results in normalization of aggression and violence. The research out of Forensic Research and Criminality International Journal in 2018 says that kids who witness animal cruelty are between 3 to 8 times more apt to abuse animals. They can be used in luring to the sex trade, to keep them, and also to keep them in the sex trade by the abuse towards the animal, threatening to hurt the animal if they leave. It's also involved in street gang behavior. Once there is abuse to an animal, to get into the gang behavior, and they will see this violence, and again it perpetuates. They become desensitized. So once they start to abuse an animal, they can increase the individuals to up to humans. The bloodshed becomes desensitized. The kids become desensitized to the bloodshed. Kids who engage in animal cruelty are more likely to abuse in the community as well, and at schools and in the family, and then when they're exposed to domestic violence. Children often engage in cruelty to animals out of curiosity or even imitation because they have been desensitized. This is normal as far as curiosity. It's when it becomes that they're so desensitized that it becomes almost like a fascination, and when they have decreased empathy, or also lack of attachment, and such things as attachment disorders. When this happens, it's almost like chasing the dragon. They need more of this excitement and the thrill of the abuse and the violence. We know that adverse childhood trauma, or ACEs, which can be considered recurrent child physical abuse, recurrent emotional abuse, sexual abuse in the home, living with a drug or a parent with a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, living with somebody who has chronic mental health illness, living with somebody who has a family member who has been incarcerated, when they've been experienced emotional neglect. These are all considered adverse childhood traumas. In 2000, the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, published research which has been repeated that at least 4 or greater of these ACEs results in higher suicide in these kids. We know that 7 times they are more likely to become alcoholics and 10 times more likely to use IV drugs. This is not alone. When there is mental health issues that result in suicides or alcoholism or drug addictions, they also associated with perhaps with IV drug users in particular, that's gang behavior, that is buying on the street, and often more violent behavior. Ironically, many human service workers, social workers, community workers have also experienced ACEs. And that's why when we talk about trauma and the trauma-informed perspective, it is so very important to consider this aspect of the animal abuse and violence that's been perpetuated. We need to understand that there is a human side to animal violence. We need to understand this actual violence link, that it is not one of, that is very well documented, an indicator of a much, much larger problem. We need to start working together, and we need to understand that law enforcement, animal welfare, veterinarians, social and community networks must start working together. For instance, mental health agencies or counselors, they need to be aware of the linkage, the links between animal abuse and human abuse and violence because of the mental health problems that are perpetuated, because of putting people in situations of abuse. We know that when the survey was done of psychiatric patients who had repeatedly tortured dogs and cats, found that all of them had a very high level of aggression towards people as well. We know that with addiction workers, addiction can stem from trauma from an individual's past, and perhaps it is the witnessing or experiencing the emotional, physical, or sexual violence with animals at the core. Social agents working with sexual offenders, we have to understand that it's not normal to break an animal's leg or poison or kill an animal. We have to understand that the two behaviors are often linked, and we need to understand that linkage. We need to understand how to report, how to cross-report, and that it has to be investigated to open up the entire schematic of situation. In sexual offenders, next to pornography, when they've been investigated, animal abuse is the most common find on a computer. Last month in October, a Florida man was sentenced to more than 21 years in prison for sexually abusing dogs and posting bestiality videos online, as well as collecting child pornography. So a clear demonstration of the abuse with humans and animals. Social workers can use the knowledge from the violence link in inquiring about children's and adolescents' experiences with animals. This can be the rapport building process. It can be trying to identify some risk factors. In domestic violence investigations, the ODERA, for instance, and Be Safer are going to start including comments and questions about the violence link and about animal abuse. Recognizing a pet's physical condition when a social worker goes into a home can provide clues to human experiences and also family functioning. Is that pet, is it very stressed? Is it terrified with certain individuals? Veterinarians and clinic staff document any suspicions from possible injury, and Dr. Doyle will speak about this, and report any suspicious abuse to law enforcement. We know that animal protection often parallels child protection. Officials were called to a tied up dog who was left with no food and no water. Inside the home, social workers found a 3-month-old boy lying near the garbage, rotten food in the ground, and half closed. Also feces and urine on the floor from the animal. So there's a huge correlation between human abuse and animal abuse and neglect. Officials reported to a neighbor's concerns of 46 sick and emaciated dogs that were confined to filthy animal carriers in inches of feces. Inside the home, they found 3 kids, 3, 10, 15, that were living in similar types of situations minus the carriers. We know that 60% of cases of child abuse also had animals in the home who had been abused. So again, this is not a one-of or random. Educators or teachers, keep an eye out for any kind of computer screening, if any kind of views about animal abuse. Columbine high school students who shot and killed 12 classmates often bragged about killing and mutilating animals prior to the Columbine shooting. Law enforcement studies have shown that violent, aggressive criminals are more likely to have abused animals as children than criminals who are considered non-aggressive. And when this is involved, they're involved with criminal investigations, domestic violence investigations, serial killers. Wortman in Nova Scotia actually had killed animals prior to his rampage. Dog fighting. There are dog fighting rings out there that a lot of people are not aware of. And again, drug usage, weapons are all involved in the desensitization of violence, as well as human trafficking. We know that all animals and humans that were residing were in a home where both animal abuse and domestic violence are known to co-occur or at a substantially higher risk of suffering severe or fatal injury, meaning the individuals, the animal and the individuals have a higher risk of death. So we need to look at the bigger picture of the violent behavior, not just what the violence is on, what animal or what living animal it's on. It's a human or an animal. We can't separate them and think of it individually. We have to think about it as a link to something bigger. As a community and professionals, we need to recognize that abuse to any living being is unacceptable and can endanger everyone, especially with the perpetuation of the violence, that it escalates. Remember, knowledge is power, and when we all know better, we all do better. And together, with all our professions and all our social agencies, we can break this violence link.
Okay. I'm going to jump to sharing my slides now. Thanks, Leslie. You're right, Hannah. I should have tried this first. Where is share screen?
If you move your cursor,
Yeah,
at the very bottom, it should say green share screen.
there. Yeah, it's really bright green. Thank you, Leslie.
No
Really
worries.
bright green. Perfect. I was looking for the not so obvious one. Okay, does that show it correctly? Is it looking right, Hannah? Maybe.
If you click on the there you go.
That one. Perfect. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thought it was easier than having you click through them. So Leslie's talked about a lot of the link, and I want to give just a little bit of information on sort of animal specific findings, because we commonly get asked, okay, well, what I go into a household as a social worker, as a law enforcement, what things can I use to maybe try and detect this link if it's there? And the short answer on it is that it can be pretty difficult. So I'm hopefully going to give you a few tips here and a few pitfalls to not fall into, some of the misconceptions when it comes to animal abuse. And as Leslie talked about, there is a lot of scenarios where animals are used as a tool in abusive relationships and in these cycles of violence. And there is, you know, with this sort of holistic view, there is the idea too where an animal can be a tool for us as people that are trying to intervene in these scenarios as well, initially to help us assess the household health overall, as Leslie talked about. So when you go into a home, look at the food bowls, look at the water bowls. Are they clean? Does the dog have a bed? Is it matted? Is it skinny? Because animals and the way that they are treated in the home can be a sentinel indicator of how the people in that home are treated as well, whether that's looking into something like neglect or whether we're actually looking for signs of abuse. They can be used as an indicator that there might be something going on with the humans in that house as well. But the other way that we have found here in Alberta through our law enforcement and our intervention services is that people love their animals. These people, whether they're, you know, wherever they're at in life, whatever conflict they're having, they care about their animals. Even the people that abuse their animal do care about their animals on some level. And that animal can be a tool for you to help bridge communication with those individuals. So certainly for victims of violence, whether that's children or women in the home, they may not want to talk about what's going on with them, but quite often they're very happy to talk about their animal and whether that animal and what's happened to it is something they're going to directly share. Building that bridge and building that rapport through the animal can often help you get deeper and get more information on what's going on in the house, building that bridge with those people. So the two photos that I have at the bottom there, Sushi is a dog that was from a home where there was significant domestic violence. And the woman that was in this situation felt very uncomfortable talking to law enforcement and to our child and family services here in Calgary about what was happening to her specifically. But she was quite willing to talk about what was happening with the animal. And our agencies here were able to build a bridge with her to let us help her get the animal looked at, and then to have her appreciate that, okay, the animal, you are an extension of that animal as well. That strong bond that you have with the animal that allows them to be used as a tool against you can also be a tool that we can use to help get you out of that house and get you somewhere safe. Looking at animals when you go in, the dog that's on the left here, I mean, clearly this dog has a lot of scars on its face. It has a lot of old injuries. Looking and seeing something like that and then using that to start asking questions about what's going on in the house is really important. So I don't anticipate that a lot of people are going to be able to walk into a house and diagnose an animal that's been abused. Often for veterinarians, even that can be difficult. But there are a lot of things we can look to as indicators that might help raise our index of suspicion that we might be dealing with an abused animal. And as lay people in law enforcement, social services, I think that assessing an animal's fear and anxiety levels in the house might be helpful. As Leslie said too, if an animal is terrified, there's a good potential that something is going on in that house. But we have to be a little bit cognizant too that a lot of times we're strangers to this house coming in. And I know that if law enforcement came into my house, my cat would be under a sofa cowering somewhere and he's not been abused. So things to take with a bit of a grain of salt. But things that we look for as far as indicators of fear and anxiety in animals, there are specific behaviors that we should be aware of and might help us detect an animal that has been abused. One of the big ones we see is animals freezing. So this fellow on the left here, we call this 4 on the floor. This is a dog that has all 4 feet planted and is literally frozen and does not want to move. So the officer that's trying to handle this animal is trying to move this animal on these little mats, and he is just absolutely shut down, all 4 feet planted on the ground, doesn't move, isn't engaging with anyone. So this animal is clearly terrified. So not moving at all, not responding is a big thing. Hiding with cats, take that one, of course, with a grain of salt. This one, I always think to a case I was involved in where we went into a home with law enforcement to investigate some potential child abuse. And there was a dog in the home. And when we came in with uniformed officers, the dog was walking around, was exploring the home, was interacting with officers that it had never met before. And when the certain individual that was accused of the violence in this home came into the room, the dog went and hid behind a uniformed officer, which is very abnormal behavior. So a version of a specific person in the home should be a twig that there might be something to that relationship between that person and that animal. Reduced exploratory behavior. Of course, this dog was moving around quite. Most of us that have animals know this behavior, know looking at this dog, and he's got his tail tucked in underneath his legs. He's got an arch back. And he has a look about him that he is afraid. And so this arched back, animals that have their hackles up like this cat, these animals are afraid. And in scenarios where you see this in a home, try and evaluate if there's potentially a legitimate reason why this animal is afraid. If a law enforcement has just kicked the door in, I think it's legitimate that an animal is afraid. And if you've come there just to have a conversation with people as a social worker, some sort of intervention services, then this may not be an appropriate behavior for an animal. Some of the more subtle ones that we see that are actually quite reliable. This posture in this cat, where it's sort of looking away, this sort of got an impression about its face that it is almost cowering and doesn't want to make direct eye contact with you. And you'll see she has her right paw just raised, and it's sort of this submissive posture. This is a sign of fear and anxiety in both cats and dogs to take on a posture like this. It's not a normal stance. It's not a normal posture. And this animal isn't overreacting, lashing out. This animal is terrified here. It's something we see in dogs as well. Some of the other signs that we see in dogs are fairly well shown in this photo here. So this dog was a victim of repeated sexual assault. And you can see he's got what we call a wall eye. So his right eye, you can see a bit of the white of the inside of his eye. He's sort of looking off to the side, like he's weary of something to the side. His ears are down. He's taking on a bit of a submissive posture. He's starting to lift that right front leg, and he's actually licking his lips. So licking the lips and yawning is a massive sign of stress in animals. If you have a dog, you'll know they don't yawn like we do. They don't wake up in the morning, take a big stretch and yawn. That's not a dog thing. And so if you're in a home and you see a dog yawning, that dog is stressed. That's a major, major sign of stress. When we talk about the perception of pain in animals, this one can be a lot more difficult. Unfortunately, there's no good way to tell. And even as veterinarians, sometimes we miss this. Animals like to hide pain. There are standardized pain scales that we use. And if anyone would like a copy of them, I'm more than happy to share them with you after the lecture that give you really specific things to look for. In a home situation, I think, big signs of pain, like an animal limping, not using a leg, combine that with a history that the animal might have been abused or there's any indication of abuse in the house, has to make you highly suspicious. If you're in a house and that animal is engaging with you, run your hands all over it. If it winces when you touch it anywhere, if it avoids touch of a certain part of its body, that should make you a little bit suspicious. Certainly if the animal vocalizes when you touch a certain part of its body, if you're rubbing the dog's head and it's happy and you touch an ear and it yipes and jumps away, there's probably something going on with that ear. It doesn't take a medical degree to know there's something going on. And then there are going to be other clear signs that an animal might be in pain. So this animal on the left, very easy to see. This dog has some skin disease over its entire body, and the dog is emaciated. You can see its spine, you can see its ribs. And this was a case where we had some significant co-neglect of children and of the animals in the home. So these are ones that you can pick up on to say, okay, there's probably something else going on in that home as well. And I wanted to just briefly address some of the really common misconceptions that we see, especially with people that don't know animals. And some of us don't have animals. Some of us don't know these things. One of the big things I hear was the cat was purring, so it obviously wasn't in pain. And that's completely the opposite of the truth, unfortunately. Cats will purr when they're in pain and when they're in distress. Yes, they purr when they're happy, but an animal with a history of being injured, if it's purring, it's more likely that it's purring because it's actually in pain. Another one I've heard is that if an animal has great recall, that it's not abused. Again, totally contrary to the truth. We see far too often animals that are some of the best behaved animals have wonderful recall are the ones that have been abused on a most chronic basis. And I think, we liken it a little bit to women that are victims of domestic violence. I can't count how many times I've heard a woman say, it's just easier to open the door, the beating will be less, right? Well, these dogs and cats feel the same way. If they come back when they're told, they're less likely to get beaten as severely. And one of the other things that we deal with and have quite a lot of difficulty with, unfortunately, in veterinary medicine and investigating cases of animal abuse is that injuries can be very difficult to see on our domestic animals. So if you look at this dog here, this is a Doberman with a history of being abused. You look at his coat with that dark coat color, the dark skin color underneath, it's virtually impossible to see bruising on this animal. So an absence of bruising visibly to the eye does not mean that there isn't any bruising. So in practice, we use infrared to detect bruising. You can see the image on the right there is the same dog, and that purple area is actually quite a large bruise over that dog's hip, not something that we would have seen just on an external exam. And this is something that, obviously none of you are going to have access to, but I just put it here to illustrate that because you don't see injuries, doesn't mean that there aren't injuries. We can have very significant internal injuries or bruising that you're not going to see any evidence of externally. So we encourage people to err on the side of there being something that you can't see and have a veterinarian look at an animal if there's been an allegation of abuse against it, just to be sure. Those are my slides. Hannah, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Doyle. Okay, let me share my screen once again. So we've gone over what the violence link is. You will hopefully now understand why the violence link is relevant to your work, that human-animal bond is an incredibly important one, and may well be the reason why your client is in conflict with the criminal justice system, having witnessed animal abuse or other kinds of trauma in the home. And also your client committing animal abuse is an indicator of other forms of criminality that you might want to be aware of. So it's about understanding your client's whole situation. And Dr. Doyle has gone over with you where you might notice signs of animal abuse, not just so that you might report the animal abuse, but so that if that animal abuse can be stopped, that may also assist your client in one of the significant factors in their lives that may be causing their conflict with the criminal justice system. So the solutions to this, well, if your client is dealing with the trauma of witnessing animal abuse or other issues in the home, then clearly they could benefit from some mental health work which deals with that trauma. Therapy dogs can be a very useful way of helping with that mental health. They are not just for victims of crime, but they can also be for other people who are experiencing trauma. So the human-animal bond is an incredibly strong one, and as Inspector Hadfield mentioned, having an animal can be a means of breaking down barriers between one human being and another, so that they open up about the issues that they might be experiencing, and having that animal there, the feeling, the touch, can really help soothe and reduce anxiety, reduce stress. Part of all of this is also humane education. So humane education is the teaching of compassion and empathy for all living beings. And the research shows that humane education impacts behavior and shows success in violence prevention. Humane education can also then involve therapy dogs as part of that education. And as Inspector Hadfield mentioned, cross-sectoral collaboration is really, really important. So social workers should be working with police officers, with parole officers, but also with people from the animal services sector. So typically cross-sectoral collaborations where they do exist are between human and human services. There's less collaboration between human services and animal services. Animal services can help because, for example, if a client is witnessing trauma in terms of animal abuse in the home, then animal services may be able to deal with that in order to remove that element of trauma for them. Okay, so now we've gone through all of that, I want to explain to you a bit more about why we Humane Canada were invited to do this work, we're invited to do this presentation, and why we're doing this work. So back in 2015, the National Centre for the Prosecution of Animal Cruelty was formed, and that is a group of Crown attorneys and prosecutors along with allied professionals, so police officers, animal enforcement, and it looks at the appropriate and efficient enforcement of animal cruelty offences. This isn't about getting longer sentences. This is about appropriate sentences that protect the victims, so the animals and the human victims, and also seek to prevent further victimization of the animals, but also the human beings that we know are going to typically be involved. And the prosecutors reached out to us and said, so the NCPAC is a Humane Canada initiative, and they came to Humane Canada and said, we are experiencing violence link in many of our cases, so we need training on the violence link. I don't think I've ever really read an animal abuse case which doesn't have some violence link element in it, i.e. there is some interpersonal violence involved as well, whether that be within the particular facts or when it comes to the sentencing report and it details the series of traumas that the perpetrator has experienced in their lifetime, and that has led them to where they are today. So it's important that prosecutors and judges understand that context. So we Humane Canada held the first ever National Violence Link Conference in 2017, and out of that was a call to form the Canadian Violence Link Coalition, which was formed in 2018, and that sits within Humane Canada. So the Canadian Violence Link Coalition has a number of missions and goals. It's to bring together stakeholders from all sectors affected by the violence link. So police officers, social workers, veterinarians, animal enforcement, parole, mental health professionals, the whole spectrum of people, of professionals that may be affected, to advance awareness, education and training among those professionals through our conferences, but also through presentations such as this, to implement prevention and intervention strategies, to establish policies and practices. Those policies may be, for example, about cross-collaboration, and then to advance research. So we have a significant amount of research on the violence link within the world and the US, and more recent research in Canada, but we need to expand it. For example, we have very little research on the violence link in terms of Indigenous communities and Black communities in Canada, even though we know that they are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and also particularly in terms of gang crime. So we have had a number of workshops. We have a conference every other year, and we also have regional workshops. So other achievements of this work. So this year we're launching the awareness, collaboration and tools to assist specifically women who have pets who are safety planning where they have gender-based violence. The evidence shows us that where a woman has a pet and she is seeking to flee an abusive situation, she's more likely to stay in that home or delay leaving if there is no suitable solutions for her pets, and that prolongs the exposure to violence for her children, and for other people that may be in the home. So we're seeking to put together practical solutions for that problem. We're supporting mandatory training for the judiciary, police and prosecutors on the violence link training for enforcement. So for example, Inspector Hadfield, who is on our strategic planning committee and undertakes significant training for enforcement for police officers on the violence link. There's been amendments to the bestiality provisions of the criminal code to reflect the issues there. We've been gathering violence link crime and enforcement statistics, supporting integration of the violence link questions into risk assessment tools. So this should be a question for clients: are there animals in your home? Are you concerned about any of the animals in your home? And then supporting amendments to VICLAS and MCM, which are crime management systems. So the coalition is growing. We had 10 members in 2008. We now have just close to 40, and we have a broad representation of sectors, which is great. In 2021 and beyond, our core values and mission remain the same, but we're continuing to advance our work. We will be launching an awareness campaign to raise awareness of the violence link among professionals such as yourself. And we will also be launching a resource centre in 2022, which will have education materials on the violence link, sector-specific materials, and a toolkit to build your own coalition in the community. So before we move on to questions, I'm going to quickly show you some resources. So on the Humane Canada website, there is a violence link page where you can find resources, including a review of the violence link literature, which is where a number of the pieces of research that myself and Inspector Hadfield mentioned, you can find those there. And there's also, I just included on this slide, the 2021 research that has just come out in October. And that is an overview of around 60 papers on the violence link. There's also a new book that has just been published. I haven't read this book, but I heard about it, so I thought I'd include it here, on the human-animal bond in clinical social work practice by Catherine Competus. So that's it from me. If you have any, thank you very much for listening today, for taking the time, for coming here today and being willing to listen to this. If you have any questions, please do let us know.
Yes, thank you, everyone. We did have one question so far about animal hoarding and behavior that is related to your findings about the violence link. And Leslie had volunteered to answer that question. So.
Yeah, I actually did a little bit of work in this area. Hoarding typically is an anxiety related disorder, as you all know, and again, trauma related, that trauma of a loss of some sort or fear of loss. So as an aspect of the violence link and neglect to these animals, it's a little bit different consideration because it's not intentional. The harm is not intentional. Although the individual is still causing harm through the neglect, through the likely poor living circumstances. So like dealing with a hoarder in general, just getting rid of the symptoms, which would be the animal confinement and their treatment, as well as the behavior of hoarding, is probably not a good place to start. You have to go into the trauma and what perpetuated the behaviors to begin with. Yeah. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Can I jump in on that one a little bit, Leslie?
Absolutely.
So I just want to say we do unfortunately see a fair bit of hoarding, and I see the animal fallout of it for sure. And definitely there's always a significant overlap with mental health issues and post and traumatic experiences prior in that person's life. And what we found really useful in a lot of the cases, as Hannah talked about, the idea of the NCPAC isn't about getting bigger sentences, longer sentences, things like this. It's about more appropriate sentencing and more appropriate outcomes dependent on what we're actually dealing with. And in hoarding situations specifically, what we've had a lot of luck with is not actually removing all of the animals that person has. We typically allow them to have at least one animal and then use that animal again as a tool in our toolkit to say, you have an animal, you have a set of conditions associated with that animal that says you must allow a welfare service in once a month to check on that animal, to check on how that animal is doing. And frequently they're very willing to do that, but you'd never get them to sign off on, can I come in once a month to check on you? And so we team up our humane services here in Calgary with mental health services to go out and check on those people, because we're checking on the animal, but then we can actually go in and check on them and check on their mental health and their welfare as well.
And that in itself, as Margaret's saying, is the collaboration between teams is so very important, rather than, charging this poor individual for abuse and neglect of these animals. Look what the underlying issue is and target it. So they still get their needs met as far as needing something to care for, and still getting this resources that they need from a social work visit, from a veterinarian to check on the animal as well, the well-being. But it's that animal bond that is needed by the human, the individual, as well as the animal needs better welfare and better care. So I can't stress this enough, the collaboration between the resources, and at the end of the day, it's about the end goal. It's about the living beings both being healthy emotionally and physically.
Then we have a question. How can we assist shelters to provide assistance such as boarding of their pets to allow them to leave, I assume leave a violent situation knowing their pets are safe?
There are a number, and we in PEI we've just established that, and to reach out and get them involved with the violence link, get them involved with shelters. The more knowledge we have that can be promoted. The only thing is that it's not promoted publicly, obviously, so that a suspect wouldn't have awareness of where the animals were being housed if a victim did leave a situation. So there are a number of shelters already. Hannah might have some of the names and contact numbers all correlated, so she can hand or perhaps get some help in that way. And I know in PEI we do have shelters that do take animals, and right now actually in PEI in our coalition we're looking at not just domestic animals but also farm animals. Horses, for instance, that seem to be holding victims in domestic situations back. So we have an interprovincial possibly an agenda to move these horses to different provinces for safekeeping while a victim leaves a domestic situation. So there are things out there for sure. And the other 2 days can maybe speak to what's happening in their areas too.
Yeah, so there's a website called Shelter Safe where you can search for women's shelters that either allow co-sheltering or have an arrangement with a local animal shelter where the animal can either be fostered into the community or kept at the shelter while the woman and her children get the care that they need. And yeah, so it's typically about communities working together so that animal services. So if, for example, you're a women's shelter, please approach the your local Humane Society SPCA, and that's what's happening across the country. It's just really at a local level that the professionals reaching out to each other, forming that network, and working together in that way to provide foster care. Sometimes adoption is the appropriate way forward if that person doesn't feel that they're able to continue caring for that animal.
Just before we wrap up, we just have someone asking to clarify, Leslie. You had potentially mentioned that someone was born with PTSD. And they're just asking you to clarify that.
Yep. Actually, they can be diagnosed as early as 6 months. So what happens is if the mom has been abused significantly and has developed PTSD, the toxins get sent through the placenta directly to that baby. So there's been research that indicates as early as 6 months, the baby is born hypervigilant, sometimes with anxiety disorder, sometimes with ADHD, perhaps like symptoms with hypervigilance and the startle reflex more typically than would be normal. So yeah, it can be diagnosed. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. This was a great presentation. I really appreciate your time, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.